Are you muted on your call-in? Is anybody able to hear us?
Okay, I just heard you ask if we could hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. Did anybody hear my introduction? Is that a no? Lisa, are you able to hear me now?
I am hearing you now.
Okay, should I redo my introduction? It sounds like no one heard it.
Yeah, I think we should just hit restart. Let's get going.
Sorry about that, everyone. Just a few audio glitches. Okay, so let me introduce myself again. My name is Olga Karanikos, and I'm the Senior Marketing Director at Credo. We're really happy to have you join us today. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping items. So if you can hear me now, please do raise your hand on the control panel option that you have. Okay, awesome. There will be a recording of the webinar shared within 24 hours. And at the conclusion of today's session, there will be a short survey that pops up on your screen. If you don't have the time to complete it now, it'll also show up in your follow-up email. We'll also be conducting 2 polls during the webinar. So when prompted, please choose the best answer to the question you will see. Lastly, if you have a question for Lisa during the webinar, please use the questions portion of your control panel to submit them, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So again, I want to thank you for joining us for Predictable Misunderstandings in Information Literacy. In this webinar, Lisa Hinchliffe, Professor and Coordinator of Information Literacy Services and Instruction at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, will share her initial findings from research into predictable misunderstandings that students harbor toward information literacy. Systematic research into these misconceptions are just beginning, and Credo is really excited to partner with Lisa to delve further into this arena. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Lisa. And Lisa, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you, Olga, and thanks to everyone for joining in here today. I'm very excited to share with you the results, or this project, I guess I should say, and how we're moving along with it. So the title of today's webinar is Predictable Misunderstandings in Information Literacy, Anticipating Student Misconceptions in Order to Improve Instruction. And as Olga said, I'll be happy for you to be sending in questions along the way, and we'll have plenty of time to address those at the end. I want to introduce to you my research team because I like to always give credit to all the people who are working on a project. So in addition to our partners at Credo, and myself as the lead researcher, I'm also working with 2 graduate students who are working on their master's degrees in library and information science, Allison Rand, who's on the right in this photo, and Jillian Collier. It's really great to have their participation as well because it helps make this research analysis so much more rich. We also are working with a really wonderful advisory board, and I've listed for you the names and their positions as well as the places that they work on the slide here. Particularly want to thank Ian Singer, the general manager of Credo Reference, who has been, if you will, my co-chair in this process of pulling together an advisory board and making sure that we have the input of the broader community as we scope this project and work it through to the end. So I want to tell you a little bit about how this project began, and particularly draw your attention to this report from the First Year Experience Survey, Information Literacy in Higher Education, which was research that was done and commissioned by Library Journal in partnership with Credo Reference. The URL that you see on the screen is a place where you can download and access this report if you'd like to read it in greater detail. I'm going to pause at this point because this is a really crucial part of this study, is the focus on first-year students. And I'd like to have us just do a couple polls to see who we are here today in the webinar. And so I'm going to ask Olga and her team there if they could pop up the first poll for us. Great, the poll is open. So, Olga, I'm not seeing it, so I'm going to ask you to go ahead and read the question.
Sure. So, Lisa's curious to know, in which type of institution do you work? Is that a university, a college, a community college, K-12, or something else?
Great, and we'll just give you a few moments to answer here.
All right, so let's take a look at the results. All right, so looks like we've got 49% at a university, 29% at community college, and then 17% in college. No K-12 and just a few others.
Okay, great, thanks. And our next one?
All right, so next question is, what percentage of your time do you spend with first-year students? Under 10%, 10 to 25? 25 to 50, or over 50%? All right, so let's take a look at the results. Looks like the majority is at 25 to 50%, but it's about an even split, Lisa, between 25 to 50 and 10 to 25.
Okay, great. That's really useful, and I think what that tells us is just how much time academic librarians really do spend working with first-year students and trying to make sure that they are successful as they begin their college journey. And of course, you know, at community colleges, we typically only have those 2 years, so it's going to be even more time spent with those first-year students. But I know even here at my large research university, we spend a lot of effort working with first-year students. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this study from Library Journal and Credo on first-year experience. In this study, librarians were asked to share a little bit about the kinds of challenges that students faced. And librarians at both community colleges and four-year colleges ranked the ability to evaluate sources for reliability as a top challenge for first-year students. That students really struggled with that evaluation process. Librarians at four-year institutions also observed that students lacked awareness of library resources and found it challenging to find the right kind of resources for their assignments. And the community colleges librarians also observed that students sometimes lacked prior information literacy experience and were not necessarily well versed in advanced research skills. So regardless, we see that many new students lack experience in using an academic library or completing research projects. So these are the findings around searching and evaluation. There's also a little bit of finding around metacognition, which is that students don't always know that they need to learn skills or that they would be helpful. So there's a lack of awareness on students' part around what they don't know and why it might be helpful if they gain these skills. They also showed that first-year students sometimes lacked an understanding of how research could benefit them. And students' overconfidence can make students less willing to attend or absorb new training. Librarians also cited other challenges such as student apathy or attitude and a lack of attention span. Finally, librarians generally noted that some students arrive that they have attended high schools without a library, and that they lack basic computer skills or experience navigating a library. So all of this sort of points to the fact that past experience is obviously what students bring with them to their collegiate library experience, and that can be a real challenge for many of our students. In addition, librarians face these challenges in trying to support first-year students. They often have very limited contact time with students. There's a lot of competing demands in the first year. Students are learning about all sorts of things, and so whether they have the time, attention, motivation to focus on information literacy is a different question. The curriculum in the first year can be very overloaded with so many different things that students need to develop skills with. We also see a real challenge of misalignment with faculty expectations. It isn't always the case that faculty are as aware as they might be about what skills students do and do not bring to college, or also how students might develop those skills. We also see a lot of librarians reporting that they're trying to do their instruction, but they struggle because the students don't have an assignment that they're working on, and so that creates a really big challenge for the librarians. So there's a lot of things in this report, and as I was reading this report, I really wanted to say, you know, there's things students come with that are sort of their attitudes, and obviously faculty assignments are what they encounter. But one of the things I wanted to think about was this idea of misconceptions, this idea that sometimes people come to college believing something that's not accurate, which is an extra challenge in the teaching process. The conceptual basis for thinking about this is in the book Understanding by Design by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTeague, in which they make this observation that learners are not blank slates. They come to a learning situation with prior knowledge, experience, and possibly some misconceptions. These misunderstandings, which are different than confusion or the attitude of inattention, they flow from prior experience and they're plausible. That means that they're an inference based on experience and they're plausible. These misconceptions then get in the way of understanding and they have to be untaught, if you will. Now, the extra challenge for us is when there is a misconception, in order for something new to be learned, those old, quote, facts and habits of thought have to be questioned and unlearned. In other words, addressing misconceptions or misunderstandings is the process of unteaching something as opposed to teaching something for the first time. Once people believe that they know something, it can be very difficult to get them to give up that thing. And it's particularly difficult if people have adopted a habit or a practice that has historically been shown to be successful. Human beings hold tight to strategies, habits, and knowledge that has previously proven to be useful and successful. This is ultimately really quite a good thing most of the time. It just sometimes gets in the way of learning in the things that we might want people to learn. So the purpose of the project that I'm currently doing is to investigate these misconceptions. The fundamental research question is, what are the misconceptions that drive errors in information literacy practice? The challenge that we're facing is that we see the errors and struggles of students, but how do we uncover the misconception, that thing which sits behind the errors and struggles, and drives students in ways that we then see as erroneous behavior or even struggles? So I want to be really clear that our goal here is a misconception inventory, which is essentially a list of erroneous beliefs. It's what students believe instead of the correct belief. Now we have to be careful because this does not mean that all students have all erroneous beliefs. A given student may have no erroneous beliefs. A given student could have all of them. But this is just the beginning of this research. It's not an empirical finding of how many students have each misconception. It's just the beginning of saying, what are the misconceptions that librarians are recognizing in their students. So this study has two phases. The first is to develop a misconception inventory, and the second was to expand and validate that inventory through librarian focus groups. So I'm going to turn now to phase one about how we develop the misconception inventory. To do so, we first extracted all the open-ended comments from the Credo Library Journal survey. There were over 400 comments. We coded each comment for an interpretation of a predictable misunderstanding. To say, well, what's behind this challenge? We also coded for each of the ACRL framework concepts to see whether that comment was potentially reflective of one of the concepts. We also coded for whether the issue was student cognition, student effect, or faculty effect. And then, of course, we had a notes free text field. The answer that librarians were answering was, what do you find challenging about teaching first-year students? And so not all of the responses were relevant. And of course, most of them were not phrased as student misconceptions. So the process again was to rephrase each comment to reflect a misconception, and then code those comments for the various aspects listed here. Then we had the process of synthesizing the misunderstandings. Synthesizing the comments to create a concise misunderstanding inventory took a few steps. First, we had to correct the comments to have consistent syntax and grammar, and then remove any direct duplicates, which moved us from about 400 comments to just under 70 comments. From there, we printed each of the comments onto physical cards and sorted them by general idea. And you can see like the literal process of doing so here. The act of physically handling the cards led us to find several other duplicates that hadn't previously been noticed, and comments that were essentially the same in content, but with slight variant phrasing. We used the card sort to do 2 rounds of data reduction until we were left with 9 summary misconceptions that fully encapsulated all of the sentiments originally expressed in the survey results. So this was a process that took place over a number of weeks as we worked through reading and rereading and reading and rereading and synthesizing. And this is, again, the advantage of having 3 people on the team, which is that, you know, as an individual person, you might sort of rush to judgment. But with 3 of us, we had to always be convincing the other 2 people of the summary and synthesizing that we wanted to make. And so that really helps us ensure that we were being thoughtful and reflective and systematic in the data reduction process. As you can imagine, you can see the torn up cards there. As we worked through this, it was, you know, there's a lot of physical activity. Sometimes the physicality is just so helpful. So we left the misconception inventory development process with 9 misconceptions, which are all listed on the slide here. But in the slides that follow, I'm going to actually show you them 3 at a time so we can look at them in greater detail. In general, we found that first-year students believed that they are supposed to do their research without assistance, and therefore they do not ask for help, and they often see the library as intimidating. We also saw evidence that first-year students believe that learners are outside of the community of scholars and not within it, and thus they do not see themselves as an apprentice in the community of practice. First-year students believe that research is linear and unidirectional process, and therefore they do not see it as an iterative process and integrated into their work. By the way, if you want to sort of test these in your own mind, in most cases, the inverse is the proper conception, if you will. So that for the correct thing is that they believe that they are supposed to seek assistance, that they should see themselves as being a member of the community of practice, that they should see research as an iterative process. So that's the way to understand this sort of misconception notion. First-year students perceive the library as a place to get books and not as a learning commons with a great variety of source types and services. First-year students believe that relevancy rankings and search results reflect quality rather than search statement relevance. And first-year students conflate achieving access and information quality, and thus they do not differentiate between finding information and finding good information. First-year students believe that freely available internet resources are sufficient for academic work because they have been successful using them and therefore do not see the value of library resources. First-year students think Google is a sufficient search tool, again, because they have been successful using it, and thus they do not see the value of library databases. First-year students believe that they are information literate, though of course they do not use that terminology. So this was the extracted, synthesized summary from the survey results in the Credo survey. But we didn't want to rely just on that synthesis. We really wanted to take our results and make sure that these resonated with the broader library community. And that led us to phase 2 of the library research project, the misconception study, which was our librarian focus groups. The librarian focus groups were made up of participants who were librarians who work with first-year college students in reference or instruction settings. Our goal in the focus groups was to expand and validate the misconception inventory. These focus groups were completed this month. Specifically, they were completed at 11:30 this morning Central Time. They were conducted online using Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. And so we were able to do these where we could bring focus group participants together from throughout the United States in order to reflect collaboratively on their experiences working with first-year students. Our goal was to have 8 to 10 participants per group. We did have one group that was smaller than that due to some scheduling issues of people who were unable to participate. So since this is a qualitative research project, we really wanted to check our interpretation with the community that provided the data, in other words, the librarian community. So we called upon their experience in working with first-year students to validate or expand our inventory of misconceptions. We asked students during the focus groups if they identified these misconceptions in their students and how they addressed the misconceptions in their teaching or reference work. We had a number of questions that was asked in order to lead them through the focus group discussions. But of course, as focus groups go, they wander and meander in each one slightly differently based on the input and participation of those who are participating in the particular focus group. Even the process of writing our questions was multi-phased, with an initial draft of questions, followed by a second draft, followed by a third draft, and after IRB approval and conducting our very first focus group, we realized, based on some of the feedback in the first focus group, that we wanted to refine those questions further, and so we did yet a fourth draft, which was used with the second, third, and fourth focus groups. By checking our results with the practiced community of librarians, this will allow us to expand upon and better understand the way that librarians are seeing the challenges that first-year students face with misconceptions. Already I can share with you that the result of doing the focus groups was the proposal for 2 additional misconceptions that had not emerged in our original set. The first being that students believe that all library resources are credible. It seems perhaps that some of the efforts in high schools in order to encourage students to use library resources, because saying that there is a certain degree of vetting, has perhaps oversold the case to the point where students have taken this not as a basic, that you can start with library resources as a good place to start, but as conclusive that all library resources are credible. In addition, many librarians observed that first-year students tend to think that every question has a singular right answer. And so the process of research is looking for the answer as opposed to exploring possible answers. We saw great consensus around the idea that students conceptualize research as linear and unidirectional. We also saw people saying that students indeed see themselves as quite separate from the community of practice, and they heavily rely on Google and internet resources. We also are going to be reflecting, because it seems that perhaps the librarians in the focus groups would like to see some nuance around this idea that libraries are perceived as places to get books. And in fact, a number of our participants observed that students are seeing libraries as only places to study and work together, and almost sort of not aware much at all about the collections and the resources. So there's much to think about there. And as I mentioned, we finished these focus groups just this morning. So for me to even be saying anything about them right now must be taken as quite a bit of speculation. So our tentative findings of the focus groups is that we've affirmed most of the synthesized misconceptions. We've revealed some additional misconceptions. We've refined and developed nuance in conceptualizations. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that we've clarified the distinctions between erroneous knowledge and lack of knowledge. So, for example, one thing that keeps coming up is that students don't know what a scholarly peer-reviewed article is. But we have been able to sort of realize that that is not a misconception. It's not that they believe something that is wrong about what is a scholarly article. They just lack knowledge of scholarly articles generally. So the good news is, and I think in my own teaching this is borne out, we can teach students something new. Look, there is this type of scholarly journal article and it's valuable, without having to unteach something else. And so though it's very important, it's not necessarily a misconception. So really trying to focus ourselves in on those things that students believe that are erroneous, isn't to say that there aren't other important things to teach, but just really gives the focus for this particular study. So what will we do with our findings? Well, of course, we will share them in both presentations as well as publications. These kind of findings, though, can be used to influence practice, particularly to influence the instructional design and pedagogical approaches that we take with our first-year students. It's not sufficient, as Wiggins and McTeague document very well, to just tell people that they believe something that is wrong. We have to create learning experiences in which they have the opportunity to explore their own thinking and realize that adjustments need to be made. We also need to be explicit about what students should believe instead. And I think we have a great example of that with the misconception that all library resources are credible. I believe that that is probably a result of an attempt to get students to evaluate the sources that they were finding online on the internet and freely available. But if we accidentally introduce a new misconception due to misunderstandings, that will then just be another thing that we have to unteach. So we want to work really hard at understanding the correct pedagogical approaches that allow students to encounter their misunderstanding and correct it, but correct it in a nuanced and sophisticated way. Obviously, this sort of study can serve as a theoretical foundation for follow-on empirical investigations. And what do I mean by that? Well, of course, what I mean by that is this is what librarians believe is happening with first-year students. Wiggins and McTeague make the point that pulling out this pedagogical content knowledge from those who teach is a very valuable activity, but it is not the same as checking empirically to see whether or not particular groups of students are laboring under these misconceptions. It could be that given the makeup of your particular student body, some of these misconceptions may be more prevalent than others. Some of them may be completely missing as well. So empirical follow-up is another step with this process. And then the partnership with Credo, of course, that this can inform the future development of Credo information literacy modules. Making sure that those commercial products that libraries might license in order to teach their students, particularly at large scale and online with the Credo information literacy modules, and ensuring that those modules are grounded in research about first-year students and the challenges that they face will make those materials equally more effective as even the one-to-one or group-based instruction that librarians do. So with that, I'm going to move us into a chance for you to ask questions, make comments, tell me if you have a reaction to any of the particular misconceptions. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts and ideas.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So as a reminder, folks, you can submit your questions and comments right in the control panel for the webinar. And I'll be fielding those for Lisa. So let me take a look at what we have so far. All right, a bunch of comments coming through. Just some of the comments, Lisa.
Right.
My students operate under these same assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
I think another misconception students may have is the idea that library resources should be easy to use.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, right? Because, so let me just comment on this. This is one of those, that's why we coded some of them for affective versus conceptual. So it's an affective state to say that you think things should be some way. So the question is, what would is that a misconception that library resources actually are easy to use and the student believes that they're not? Or is the reality that library sources aren't easy to use and the student correctly believes that they're not easy to use? So this is, I'm just giving you a little insight into the kind of conversations we had to have, because should statements are in the affective domain, and they certainly affect learning. In no way absolutely, they're hugely important for learning. So if students believe library resources should be easy to use and they're not, that's definitely going to be a disconnect. But it may or may not be a misconception based on saying, okay, but what's the belief? Is the belief that library resources are easy to use, or is the belief that they're not easy to use? And then is that belief correct?
Right.
It's complicated.
Okay.
I'm giving you insights into the literally probably 8 hours that the GAs and I spent reading and saying, okay, but what about, okay.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are commenting through that they agree in general, and there are a bunch of caveats to different things that I'm sure you've run into.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's great, yeah.
So I think that goes into a good question of when will the final findings be published?
Sure, our goal is for them to be shared at midwinter. So midwinter ALA conference this year is later. I believe it's like the second or third week of February. Yeah. And I know that we're working with Credo to sort of see if we can have maybe an event at the booth or something, some way of kind of giving a chance for people to get together and talk about these things as well.
Perfect. Okay. I'm going to whiz through a few more questions.
Great.
What words do students use to describe information literacy?
Great. So I think important to remember is that we don't have any of students' own words in this study. We have librarian words about students. But I can share with you that as the focus groups have discussed this question, they've mentioned that students are often sort of talking about information literacy as digital literacy. I can manipulate the tools, I know how to search, I can use Google. It's kind of a hybrid of digital literacy and internet literacy, which, you know, they may not realize that there's sort of more to it.
Perfect. And what are some types of pedagogical approaches librarians mentioned using to address the misconceptions? And we had another question particularly on those same approaches for the FYE, or the first year experience students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the way I can sum up, because I mean, people shared a lot of, you know, very specific activities or like, but the thing I can sum up and say is the pedagogical approaches that people were sharing and reporting as most effective, which honestly makes sense to me, are those approaches that give students an experience and then ask them to reflect upon that experience and don't rely heavily on lecture, okay? Because you can't sort of, expertise can't be sort of transferred by telling somebody, especially in this kind of applied area. So a librarian this morning, for example, mentioned showing students how to manipulate even the display of the results in a particular library database. Like, what if we display these newest first, rather than top hits first? So that's a very simple thing, but even just sort of moving students into being a more active agent in manipulating and sorting through their search results. Also asking students to be reflective and asking them questions like, why do you think this came up this way? One thing that came up is that students often are bringing their Google mental model to a library database. And it's not that the Google mental model is wrong, as long as you're using Google, but if you're starting to assume things about library databases based on Google, that may be a challenge for you, and it may lead you to make some mistakes and overlook information. A number of people also commented that ultimately a lot of this is driven by faculty assignments. And when faculty assignments sort of present research as a very linear thing, it's very hard for a librarian to then teach that it's not linear. So I think, you know, there's a secondary strategy, which is how do we improve the assignments such that the assignment itself gives students some of these experiences.
Perfect. And would the final report include strategies to address these misconceptions or share some of these pedagogies?
Right, yeah, so the final report will, you know, obviously report the research results, but in the discussion and the implications, we'll be talking about, you know, what do these say for practice?
Yeah, great. And just a side note, I've had a bunch of questions coming through regarding the recording and the presentation. So great news, Lisa, there's a lot of interest. We will be sharing the recording with all of you within 24 hours. We also can share the presentation slides. When you do receive that follow-up survey, just note that you're interested in receiving the presentation so that we can shoot that out to you after we finish today. Mm-hmm. All right, a couple other questions. Do you think these observations could be applied to the public library as well?
So I think Obviously this was framed around asking what first-year college students believe. So first-year college students are probably also high school seniors not that long ago. So in that sense, yes. I would be hesitant to necessarily say whether or not this applies to another population. So does this apply to, parents of children? I just don't know that we would, I don't necessarily know that we can make that assumption that these are the same misconceptions. But what I can say is even just starting to sort of take this list and then ask yourselves, what am I seeing people do that, and pushing yourself beyond sort of that frustrated reaction of, oh, if they just would do this thing I know they should do, but really try and reflect and say, okay, let's assume that everyone's doing what they think is a good search strategy. Even though we can see it has mistakes in it, where do those mistakes come from? And so it's this iterative process of trying to peel back the layers and say, I can see a mistake, but what's the cause of that mistake? And so maybe some of these misconceptions are also at play in other populations, but maybe there's something else going on as well.
Great. And one attendee is curious if there are any plans to extend the research in misconceptions held by disciplinary faculty.
That sounds like another next study that could definitely be done. I don't necessarily know that I'll be doing that particular next study, but this is a great thing about scholarship, right? Is that other people can build on it as well. And if somebody was interested in doing that, I would be more than happy to have an offline, phone chat or something with them about, more logistics of the process.
Perfect. And just going back to your discussion on, or your details on the focus groups, can you remind everyone how many focus groups you ran? And just to clarify, those were completed in November 2017. I think there was a little typo.
Oh, does it say 18? Oops.
Yeah, so they're no longer going on. They have been completed this month.
Yes. Sorry. Well, that's why we need editors. Yes. The focus groups were completed in November of 2017. There were 4 focus groups. They were held over the last 3 weeks. The last one was held this morning. Each focus group was supposed to have 8 to 10 people in it, and most of them did have 10 people. We had one that only had 6.
Perfect. Okay. And have you noticed any different in assumptions from traditional first-year students versus non-traditional?
That's really interesting because we didn't have a specific question about that, but the librarians brought that up a lot. And I think the way I would sum this up is it is clear that past experience is driving current behavior of our users. And sometimes it kind of cut both ways in the discussions. A number of people mentioned that with the statewide licensing to some scholarly databases, sometimes the high school students do have access to scholarly databases. And so they come to college actually already knowing this concept of like the academic database. Flip side is that non-traditional students, who graduated from high school 20 years ago probably didn't have that database, but perhaps they come with less confidence in their digital skills and their ability to search the internet. So it kind of, it's not entirely clear that this is cut and dried. So and also I wouldn't say that any librarian was like, these misconceptions only appear in traditional versus non-traditional. But it did seem like there was some attitudinal differences that librarians were pointing to. And I mean, I'll be really honest that I think the attitudinal differences would be another great study that could be done.
Perfect. And how would you explain these misconceptions to faculty who are unfamiliar with information literacy? How could it help students with giving them that understanding?
Sure. So, I mean, I suspect that a lot of faculty also recognize these misconceptions in their students if they took, if you shared this list with them and said, do you see this happening with your students? And in fact, I think a number of the faculty assignments that librarians talked about being frustrated with, you could almost see in them where the faculty member was trying to solve or address one of these problems, but maybe was doing so in a way that was sort of creating another problem, right? So this is one of our challenges, right? So anytime we go to address one issue in an instructional design, we have to always be careful that we don't create a new problem. So, for example, a number of librarians said, well, one of the challenges with students seeing research as linear is they have these scaffolded assignments where first they have to turn in their topic, then they turn in a summary, then they turn in 5 articles, then they turn in 5 abstracts, then they turn in the draft of their paper. Well, nothing in that process then sort of encourages the students to think about an iterative thing where you might change your topic based on the articles that you found. But at the same time, that scaffolding is really positive for other learning outcomes. So I think, part of what I guess I would take away from this is that in reality, this is a much more complex and difficult thing to teach than we sometimes think about it or talk about it as being, because we realize the time pressure, so we're trying to get it all done in 1 hour, and we might be better off sort of kind of changing this a little bit to talk about the complexity and the difficulty, but hey, let's get started on it, because there is this complex relationship where you work on one problem, you might need to do it over time.
Right. And we received one comment. You might have some thoughts on this, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
Cannot improve the faculty assignments, in my opinion. We have to work around them. Sometimes the faculty assignment is very limited. Sometimes there are no results on the databases. It's very frustrating for students and librarians who are trying to guide them. I think what's needed is separate library class instruction in high schools or for freshmen in college. What's your reaction to that?
So I'm a big advocate for credit-based information literacy courses in college and in high school. I think this sounds so simplistic when I say it, but the reality is 16 weeks of instruction on a topic is better than 1 hour. And so it's absolutely the case that we're going to be limited in what we can do in an hour. Having said that, I think many libraries would be very challenged to get an information literacy credit class or to staff it. But I'm team InfoLit credit classes for sure. So, I mean, I would encourage people to work in that vein and to pursue those more intense options. I just think at the same time, for students who don't have that as an option, I don't want to give them nothing.
Right. And I could say from our side too, one thing Credo's working on is creating partnerships between local high schools and state universities. We started this with Arkansas State University actually, where our information literacy modules are placed within the high school and connections are created between those high schools and the university so that feeder programs, and especially institutions that get a large portion of local students, are getting students that have some preparedness in that specific skill set. So that's one way where we're trying to help different institutions and customers and creating those sorts of partnerships to do exactly that, just have the students coming in with a basis of knowledge. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. And I mean, I previously worked at a community college, and then I worked at a 4-year school that had a lot of feeder schools that we could really identify. And that was one of the things that we then did, is we actually created a network. I mean, we didn't have online tutorials at this point. We just even started meeting a couple times a year to talk about what students were learning, what the expectations were, to kind of create a dialogue among the librarians across the state of Illinois. And my current institution, it's a little bit more challenging in that we actually get as many students from a couple schools in Shanghai, China, as we do from certain schools in Illinois. So I think that strategy is great when you're really sort of regionally focused and a little harder at some other institutions. But this also just points to the fact that different institutions should pursue the correct strategies for them and not necessarily assume that one size fits all.
Right. Mm-hmm. All right, well, Lisa, we're running into almost the end of time, and we've got a lot of comments coming through. It's certainly an engaged group, which is fantastic. So really appreciate all of you guys sticking through to the end and being so interested. We're sure to do more sessions like this with Lisa and keep you abreast of the findings. We're excited to put everything out to you in the winter, so in January, February. So if you have questions in the meantime, you certainly know where to find us. And if you are interested in any further Credo webinars, we do have another one coming up. Lisa, if you wouldn't mind going forward one slide. We have one coming up in mid-December about assessing first-year students, and that's with librarian Ray Pun from Cal State Fresno. He's been doing a lot of sessions with us on how to use Credo in your libraries. So if you joined that or are interested in some more, here are the details. You can use the link on the screen to register. Otherwise, like I said, we'll be in touch with the recording of today's session. You can feel free to pass that on to colleagues or come back to us with any questions. So thank you again. Thank you, Lisa. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And just to reiterate to everyone, I'm pretty easy to find online, website lisahinchliffe.com, and I'll be more than happy if you want to follow up with any questions, just shoot me an email. And as I said, if anyone's interested in building on this research with their own research project, honestly, nothing would thrill me more than to talk with you about sort of more of the logistics and how you can learn from what we did in order to see this research continue. Because I think, you know, as with, I guess this is going to be my sign that I think this research project has been particularly successful in that it seems to have generated many more research questions. So we learned some things, but we also have a lot of questions we can now ask, and that's very exciting. So please be in touch.
Lisa, do you mind going to your very first slide with your name? A few people were asking about how your name is spelled, so they can indeed find you.
Okay, let's, I should have put that on the last slide too, shouldn't I? Oh, okay, Lisa, yeah, there it is.
There you go, folks. So if you do need any information or need Lisa's email or anything like that, you can also contact us back when we do shoot that recording out to you tomorrow. So again, thank you all very much, and we hope you have a great afternoon.